It's the mid-90s, and reality television is in its infancy with the real world.
I thought, this is not going to happen. They can't do this to 7 people.
At first, many critics dismissed the show as trash, along with everything else about MTV.
I haven't seen it. I don't watch it.
It's all entertainment. There's no message, no attempt to educate.
But one young man has a crazy dream of getting on the show so he can use it for something nobody had ever tried: saving lives.
Yeah, he had an agenda.
There's just one problem. He might have a very limited time to do it.
I will probably not see the age of 30. I will probably die before I turn 30 years of age.
And when he does get on the show, he realizes his mission is going to be even harder than he thought. He'll have to confront hostile castmates.
You just shut up.
Can you listen?
I've had it with you.
Deadly homophobia.
How can somebody who doesn't know me hate me so much?
And a choice between his family and his friends.
I'm the one who's gonna make the decision whether I go back home or not.
How can one person go up against so much and win?
I'm very worried. I can hear something ticking. Something bad's gonna happen.
This is the story of Pedro Zamora.
Pedro Zamora.
Pedro Zamora.
And the year that transformed reality TV and an epidemic.
You have to find some type of meaning to your life.
It all starts with a miracle baby named Pedro, born in 1972. After having 7 kids, his mom had been told she couldn't have any more, so his arrival was a surprise. The family's Santeria faith leader told them Pedro was sent to save lives, and a priest told them to attach a silver chain to his ankle so angry spirits couldn't steal him. This charmed kid spent the first years of his life living in poverty. The family had a shack with just a dirt floor. Food was scarce. Clothes were made from scraps and hand-me-downs. One reason for the hardship, his father had fought for Castro in the Cuban Revolution, but after Castro won, Pedro's father had become disillusioned and spoke out openly against him. That made them enemies of the regime and made it hard for them to find work. But Pedro didn't know about any of that then. He was a happy kid, carefree, doted on by the older siblings. His parents wanted a better life for him, and they got a shot at it in 1980. The Cuban government allowed a mass exodus of anyone who wanted to leave, and the whole Zamora family packed up, headed to some docks, and waited for their turn to get on a boat. They waited for 5 days. And then they were finally cleared when officials stopped them. 5 of the older siblings were near military age, they said. They would have to stay.
Pedro's mother and father didn't want to go, but the oldest children said they insisted that they go so the younger children could have a better life than they had.
So Pedro was ripped away from the older brothers and a sister who'd looked after him, and they took a scary, stormy boat ride from Cuba to Miami, packed tight with strangers. Many of them criminals that the Cuban government was trying to get rid of. When they arrived in Miami that night, relief workers met them at the docks, and one handed Pedro an apple. He started to cry because it was the first time he'd ever held one. It was painful for the family to be separated. But the Zamoras resolved to build a new life for themselves in the U.S. And they had high hopes that the rest of the family could soon follow. With the older siblings gone, the Zamora family became even more tight-knit. Especially Pedro and his mom. She was his best friend. She taught him to dance, to play checkers. They did everything together. He loved everything about her, from her gentle kindness to her long black hair, which she never cut. Just 3 years after arriving in the U.S., Pedro's mom started to feel unwell. And when she went to the doctor, they got the news it was cancer. It was already pretty far along, and the treatment was painful, made her very sick. Pedro wanted to help, but he could only watch as his mom got weaker and weaker until, less than 2 years after the diagnosis, she passed away. Pedro was just 13 years old. After she died, he was going through her things, and he discovered that even though the family didn't have much, she had left him something. A lock of that long, dark hair that he'd always loved. First, his family had been ripped apart by the Cuban government. Now, he'd lost the person that he was closest to in the world. But he didn't cry. He told his older sister Millie that he was going to become a doctor to save lives like their moms. So he threw himself into schoolwork. He was an honor student, he did cross country, he was in science club. In high school, his classmates voted him the most intellectual. He did whatever he thought would help him get admitted to med school. The family called him the executive. He was going to be the first in the family to go to college. But despite that driven, successful appearance, Pedro was suffering. Almost a decade after leaving Cuba now, half of his siblings were still stuck there. Plus, his mother's death had left him with an aching loneliness. He longed for affection, and he found affection through hookups with men.
I was missing the love, the hugs, the kisses that I was getting from my mother. So through sex, I could get them. I could get those hugs, those kisses, that attention, that love.
To those who knew him best, he was an overachiever, a perfect son, a brother, a student. But there was a side that he kept hidden, one that was very sexually adventurous, and that brought him into contact with older men who didn't always have his best interests at heart. At 17, Pedro volunteered for a blood drive at school, and a few weeks later, a letter arrived telling him that they'd found something wrong. That's how he found out that he was HIV positive. In an instant, his entire life changed. His concerns went from how am I going to get into med school to how much time do I have to live. In the 1980s, life expectancy after an HIV diagnosis could be as little as a few months to maybe a few years. He had no idea how to get treatment, or what his life would even be like, because there was very little info in public schools back then. Virtually nothing about HIV and same-sex relationships. Pedro had had one lecture in a health class, but it was so vague, he didn't even know that what he was doing was putting him at risk. He'd never even heard about condoms or getting tested, and he just assumed he'd be safe as long as the people that he hooked up with looked healthy. When it came to education, a lot of people just didn't want to talk about HIV, and that silence cost a lot of lives. It's why ACT UP's slogan was silence equals death. That wasn't an exaggeration. There was also another crisis for Pedro: whether to tell his family. They were very religious. He had reason to be concerned. A lot of people who came out as queer or HIV positive in the 1980s got kicked out of their home and disowned. After losing his siblings and his mother, losing the rest of the family would be too painful to bear. It took him a few days to work up the nerve. He sat the family down and started to talk, and he told them everything. They were devastated. His father said he felt like a door was closing. He wondered, why not me? I'm old. I've lived my life. Here's a young man whose life is just beginning. But family also said they'd support him no matter what. That was a huge relief, but his future was still completely uncertain.
So what I have to learn how to do is to learn how to live with AIDS.
He was just 17. He had no idea what to do with the time that he had left, or even how much time that might be. Then, one day at school, there was a class discussion about homosexuality. Pedro, who was still mostly closeted, listened as classmates talked about how disgusting they found gays. One classmate bragged about beating up a gay man. And finally, Pedro couldn't hold back. He told them he was gay. He was HIV positive. He told them they had no idea what they were talking about and what a life like his was really like. Then after class, his teacher came up to him. She said everyone had just learned a lot and asked if he'd be willing to do a more official talk about being HIV positive for the whole school. Now, Pedro wasn't sure. He'd always been afraid of public speaking, especially since English was not his first language. But one afternoon, he got up in front of his peers and started talking about what it's like to be gay, how he acquired HIV, how they could avoid transmission, why they should get tested. Most of his classmates were getting this info for the first time, and they were all riveted. Before he knew it, Pedro was getting invites to do talks at other schools, community groups, churches. He decided he needed to make this his full-time gig, to double up on schoolwork so he could graduate early. 1 year earlier, Pedro thought he was going to become a doctor so he could save some lives. Now, he knew he might not live long enough to make it through college, but maybe he could still save some lives through education. Finally, he knew what he wanted his future to be. But that vision came with a new challenge. How could he reach as many people as he could in the limited time he had left? So after graduating early, Pedro moved out on his own, still close to family, just in his own place with a friend named Alex. And for the next 2 years, Pedro kept busy doing talks. He traveled the country. He was featured in newspapers and magazines. The Wall Street Journal put him on the front page. He even got to appear on Oprah.
What do you have to say?
This is not a moral issue. This is a health issue. And we have to look at it from that standpoint.
And that was great. But each appearance was still quite brief. Pedro still didn't think he was doing enough.
He wanted to reach as many people as possible with his message because he didn't want to just lecture about it and talk about it. He wanted people to actually see how somebody with AIDS lived.
It was sometime in 1993 that his roommate Alex heard that an MTV show called The Real World had opened auditions for season 3 in San Francisco. He brought it up to Pedro. Maybe this was a way he could reach more people with his message. Now that's a very different reason than most people auditioned for The Real World. The show was still pretty new at that point. The term reality show wasn't even being used. They called it a docu-soap. But even though it was still pretty new, people had figured out that The Real World could get them famous. Past roommates had turned their fame into jobs as MTV personalities. posed for Playboy, started their own talent agency. In fact, at the same time that Pedro was thinking about auditioning for the show, record labels were coaching musicians to apply as a marketing strategy. One of them was the singer Jewel, who made it pretty far down the audition process before she pulled out. In any event, Pedro decided he was going to apply. He wrote one of the best cover letters I think I've ever seen. He's really clear about what makes him a good fit for MTV, and also what makes him unique. I think it is important for people my age to see a young person who looks and feels healthy, can party and have fun, but at the same time has to take 5 pills daily to stay healthy. Pedro describes what he hopes to do in San Francisco, some health-related, find a job with the local AIDS organization, do presentations on living with HIV, find a doctor, and others not quite so health-related, like bowling, rollerblading, movies, dancing. Very important, find a Cuban restaurant and a place that serves Cuban coffee. Last but not least, and most important of all, in all caps, dating. When they got this letter, the show's producers were fascinated. They had had queer people on the show before. In the first season, there was a roommate named Norman. Although he wasn't initially supposed to be on the show, a producer met him by chance, and afterwards they begged the others to put him on. And we don't have time for that whole story here, but I'm posting bonus videos over on Patreon about the first season of The Real World, about a nude scandal that nearly shut down production, and how the roommates wound up getting back together early in the pandemic. You can get those videos and lots more at patreon.com/mattbaum. So back to Pedro in the middle of '93. When his letter arrived, the Real World producers were intrigued. They asked him to tape an audition.
We did the video and the interview, and he was a nervous wreck.
Half of my brothers are in Cuba and half are here. Oops.
The further he got into this process, the more nervous Pedro was getting. He knew that being on TV could be stressful. He wrote, "I know that being on The Real World would mean exposing the most intimate details of my life on national television." And there was also the thought of spending time away from his family.
I'm a little bit afraid of being away from them, and I've never been away from them for more than a few weeks at a time.
His sister Millie, who'd taken care of him after their mom died, was nervous too.
And I say, oh my God, you crazy, Pedro. This is not for you.
But on the other hand...
And he say, no, that's the only opportunity that maybe that I can have to get out, to everyone on this world. And it's true.
This was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to reach the whole world. So a few months later, when MTV called to offer him a place in the cast, he said, okay. The family threw him a party to celebrate. And in early 1994, Pedro packed up and headed to California for an adventure that was about to change his life in ways that he could not imagine.
I feel pretty excited, but I also feel kind of like I'm leaving my family.
One of the most immediate concerns was meeting his new roommates.
I was very concerned about how they were going to find out that I was HIV positive and how they were going to react to it.
The producers had cast a pretty diverse group. There was a singer-poet, a med school student, a young Republican, a dirtbag who said he was a bike messenger, a cartoonist, but they didn't know anything about each other yet. The only thing the producers had told them is that one of the roommates would be HIV positive, but not which one. It was up to Pedro to figure out when to tell them, or if. And on one hand, that's great that he was in control, but it's also a really stressful position. Meeting a bunch of strangers he's going to have to live with for the next 5 months, and you might think that after years of doing talks, Pedro would be used to coming out. But
Every time I tell somebody I am HIV positive, it gets as hard. It's as hard as the first time I did it.
And ever since the producers had told him someone was HIV positive, the other roommates were worried too. One of them, the cartoonist, Judd, had been looking forward to being on the show, at least at first. I talked to Judd about what was on his mind going in.
I thought it was going to be a stupid good time. That's why I wanted to do it. I thought at worst, I'd get to be on TV, and that was cool.
But when Judd found out that someone in the cast had HIV, he thought,
I'm this close to being on The Real World, and I have to live with someone who has AIDS? Why can't I be like on last year's cast? Why can't I live with like that obnoxious surfer, the cranky Irishman? Or
Plus, he was just scared.
The truth was, when I was thinking about living with someone who was HIV positive, in my head, it was like I was living with someone like the HIV virus walking around on 2 legs.
At the time, fear was a pretty common reaction to HIV. There's a lot of misinformation about what it was and how you could catch it.
People are saying you can catch AIDS from a mosquito bite or in swimming pools. The fact is, there isn't a single case of AIDS on record caused by casual contact.
Just a few years earlier, Princess Diana had visited people with HIV in a hospital, and just the fact that she was willing to hug them was a major news story.
HIV does not make people dangerous to know, so you can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it.
Depictions in the media were bleak. People with HIV were usually shown as tragically suffering or on the verge of death, or as a threat to everyone around them.
At first, only gays and IV drug users were being killed by AIDS. But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it. Over 50,000 men, women, and children now carry the AIDS virus. In 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead.
As the roommates arrived at the house and got to know each other, Judd initially assumed that the HIV-positive roommate was the dirtbag, Puck, because he looked sick. At the time, some people with HIV had lesions, and there was a common misperception you could just tell who had HIV by looking at them. That was one of many myths that Pedro was about to run up against. So, knowing how nervous they might be, at first, Pedro was cautious. He met up with one roommate, Corey, before they arrived at the house, and you can see him dance around the topic of being gay.
And now, did you have to leave a girlfriend to come here this time, or no?
To leave what?
Girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever.
No, I've been dating.
When he mentions what he does for work,
to go around the schools and speak about HIV and AIDS.
The mood gets awkward.
AIDS education, I said AIDS.
No, AIDS.
So I told her that I did AIDS education, then changed the conversation.
And as they approach the house, he's still nervous about how the others will respond. When he first arrives, he holds back. He just drops hints, references to doing drag, or little jokes to see how people react.
Lombard Street is the crookiest street in the United States, which I find kind of interesting because I pretty much do not want anything straight in my life.
Literally nobody picked up what he was trying to say. But they do notice something else about him.
Right off the bat, he's very sweet. He's very, very nice, very fun.
Pedro and Judd found they had a lot in common.
I discovered he liked Star Trek: The Next Generation. So we're going to watch Star Trek a lot, and talk about it and be nerds. Like, oh, you're kind of nerdy.
We never get to hear that Star Trek conversation on the show, which is a real shame because I would love to know Pedro's thoughts on the dress uniforms.
And you, Jean-Luc, I wasn't aware you had such handsome legs.
Pedro and Judd got along well enough that while they unpacked, Pedro cautiously mentions to Judd that he's an AIDS educator. And Judd realized, oh, I was wrong about who it was. And that changed things for him.
And in the couple of hours that I was talking and hanging out with him, I liked him quite a bit. And now I find out that he's HIV positive. And it's like, oh, okay, it's Pedro. Suddenly this was a person. Suddenly this had a face.
Judd could see his assumptions were a little off. And to his surprise, he realized that now he felt relief. He'd gotten to know Pedro, saw that he wasn't sick or tragic or scary as he'd expected. He was just a friend, not a walking virus. So far, so good. And by the way, I talked to Judd at much more length about being on the show and getting to know Pedro. If you want to see that full interview, you can check the links in the description. Coming out to Judd went well, but Pedro knew this one person at a time approach wasn't going to work. So at the end of the first day together, he finds a very clever way to come out to everybody at once. He had brought a scrapbook with articles about all his work.
When they open the scrapbook, there's this picture of me that says, I am living with AIDS.
He uses that to show everyone exactly who he is and what he does. This is pretty brilliant, a way of letting the articles do the introducing for him, and showing everybody some more depth. Here's another one of the roommates, Pam.
When I first met Pedro, we didn't have much to go on than our stereotypes. So I was the medical student, and he was the AIDS educator. And the first night we were living in the house, I learned his story.
Pam's an interesting person to have in the house. As a med student, she understands what Pedro's going through and how to explain it to the others. For example, early on, Pedro gets a blood test that shows that his T-cell count is very low. And Pam describes what that means.
It's hard to think of what a T-cell is, but basically it's the cell in your blood that gets destroyed by the AIDS virus.
Pam's also had a lot of gay friends, including her high school boyfriend who came out to her senior year, and the two stayed so close she wound up taking him to the prom. So Pam's cool with Pedro. What about the others?
I was pretty familiar with the disease. Living in San Francisco, you have to be.
Most of them are great, with one exception. Rachel, the conservative one.
She just got up and left, and I took that as a sign of rejection.
Rachel's fallen for a lot of misinformation about HIV.
I want
wanted to know that I was okay, that I was going to be safe. Some people may say, oh, that's ignorant. We all know, HIV can't be trans. But you know what? I don't know. I've never lived with anybody with HIV. There may have been in the back of my head something, well, I'm sharing a bathroom with somebody that has HIV.
First, she snubs him, and then she acts like she's the victim.
He's the one with the disease. He should make me feel comfortable. And that's selfish, but that's how I felt. And I felt like,
selfish, it's wrong.
Typically, the more misinformation people believed about HIV, the more likely they were to be afraid of it. And that fear showed up in a lot of ways. Sometimes kind of subtle, like Rachel shunning him. But imagine if she was in a position of more authority here, like a landlord. Around this time, it was very common for landlords to evict people if they just suspected they were HIV positive. That ignorance and fear even got to people who should know better. A lot of doctors refused to treat patients who had HIV. Hospitals might turn them away. The fear around the virus, driven by misinformation, was literally deadly. And Pedro's there to educate people like Rachel. But that's not going to be easy if she refuses to listen. So watch how he responds to Rachel's rejection. First, he doesn't ignore it.
The day that you sat down and 5 minutes later you got up and left, that was to me a form of rejection.
Next, he tells her how her rejection hurt. And he says he knows she's scared, but also...
You have to understand that this is scary to me.
He's telling her he's afraid too. And that's something they share.
We have a lot in common. Besides being both Latinos. You will understand better my relationship with my family, my attachment to my family.
Very true.
And I'm sure you felt the same way.
And pointing out how similar they are, that works.
The person in the house that I have the most in common with, besides the fact that he's gay, is Pedro.
Pretty soon, Rachel forgets about being scared. And that means she's more likely to listen.
He would slip things into conversation very early on about casual contact. Now you don't get HIV through casual contact and what that means. So what began with educating us is what later would be, he's educating the cameras.
But he's not just there to be everybody's teacher.
Just because I have AIDS doesn't mean that the rest of my life stops.
Pedro has a life, and that includes a sex life. A year before, he was at a rally in D.C. He met a cute boy named Sean from San Francisco, who also did HIV education. And now that Pedro's in town, Pedro's invited Sean to do some talks together. Or maybe a little more.
Sean said,
yeah, you know Sean, okay?
He's so cute.
He is cute. He is cute.
I'm going to go out with him on Thursday night.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. You don't waste no time, do you?
We see Pedro and Sean go out, and the show sets it up like it's a first date. But it's actually not their first date. Ahead of time, Pedro went to the producers off camera, and he asked them not to follow the two of them at first. This relationship is a big deal for him because Sean is also HIV positive.
This is the first time that I am going out with somebody who really understands what I'm going through because he's going through the same thing.
Pedro told the producers he wanted some time alone. Dates are stressful enough, but having the cameras there would be too much. It's easy to forget that in every scene you see, there are a ton of people hidden just off camera. I talked about how weird that feels with Danny Roberts, who was on The Real World New Orleans a few years after Pedro.
You can never overlook the fact that there are people walking around amongst you who are absolute strangers carrying huge cameras and booms and things. It's just, so you're always subconsciously hyper aware of having these crews and this equipment around you and being watched and recorded.
Like with Judd, Danny and I talked at much more length about Pedro and coming out on TV, and I'm posting a link to that interview in the description. So getting back to Pedro, even though reality shows were still pretty new at this time, he instinctively knew there needed to be some separation between his personal life and his on-camera life. And the producer said, okay. They gave them some distance, at least at first. After a couple dates, Pedro got a little more comfortable and he said, okay, the cameras can come too. And on one of those early dates, you get a glimpse of one more reason that he was so cautious.
You cannot expect me to go from an extremely homophobic and racist environment and go down the street and hold your hand and feel totally comfortable. I can't.
I get that. I moved to San Francisco about 10 years after Pedro, and even though it's a very gay city, after years of having to always look over your shoulder,
I am still walking on the street holding your hands, and still part of me is looking behind to see if the guy who I just passed is gonna come with a bat and break my head open.
Pedro's definitely taking it slow with this relationship.
I don't want to like him too much. I want to go back home, and we're spending a lot of time together.
My plan is to go back to Miami, and there's no way he could leave San Francisco.
But on the other hand, Sean is really hot, and they get along great.
When I went out with Sean and I realized that I was attracted to him a lot more than I thought I was.
The roommates like Sean too, and they joke around with him.
We want to know if you can make an honest woman up.
There's a really sweet moment during one of the episode end credits where Sean has come over to have dinner with them.
This asparagus has not been cooked.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yes.
You're positive?
Yes.
The asparagus is hot, Pedro.
I just love this glimpse of them teasing each other like a married couple.
And this asparagus is not cooked. So are they cooked, Pedro?
And sure enough, the more time they all spend together, Pedro realizes.
I'm thinking a lot about him. I miss him when he's not around.
You think you're falling in love with him?
Yep.
That seems great, right? What could be better than falling in love? But there's a reason to maybe hit the brakes. Pedro's entire support network is in Miami. His friends, his work, his doctors. He could develop a lot of that in San Francisco, but he'd be starting from scratch. And there's one thing he couldn't replace.
I don't know anything but my family. They have been my whole life.
My decision right now is either whether I want to have a long-distance relationship with Sean or with my family.
And so halfway through the season, Pedro flies home to see his family and tell them about this boy that he's been seeing.
I saw my sister, Millie. The first thing that she did was to open my jacket and say, which means that I'm skinny.
But before he has a chance to tell him about Sean...
And I was really feeling fine, except that when I would breathe in deep, I would have this little pain on my chest.
Probably not the best time to break that news. The family's too focused on looking after Pedro.
She's telling me, you have a fever, we have to get the thermometer out. No, I don't want a thermometer.
And the next day...
Basically, when I breathe, my chest hurts. My biggest concern is that it could be pneumonia.
He's right to be concerned. Remember that T-cell test that Pam helped explain?
Generally, if you have over 500 T cells, which is normal, you don't have any symptoms. 100 is low.
Your total helper's T cells are 32 right now.
That means Pedro's immune system is very weak. The show doesn't go into this, but in 1994, pneumonia was a serious condition for people with HIV. One study from the CDC around this time showed that in cities with a high incidence of people with AIDS, deaths from pneumonia had more than doubled. And even among people with HIV who recovered from pneumonia, another study showed they were 4 times more likely to die in the next 4 years. Pedro doesn't know if that's what he has, just he needs to find out as soon as possible. But there's a problem. Pedro has no health insurance. In fact, at this time, a lot of people with HIV had no coverage because insurance companies didn't want to pay for care. So they'd simply refuse to extend coverage, or they'd charge astronomical rates for having a pre-existing condition. Just getting coverage or taking a trip to the emergency room without it could bankrupt you. The insurance companies even shared a list of people with HIV. So if one company found out your status, they'd tell the others, and then none of them would cover you. The worst part of all this is that it created a perverse incentive to never get tested, so they wouldn't have grounds to refuse you. As a result, many people who needed to get tested most so they could get treatment or learn about safer sex would avoid getting tested at all costs. If you were lucky and lived near a major city, you might be able to get into a free clinic. But those could be unpredictable. When Pedro calls one of the places where he used to get care...
We're kind of a corporation right now. Patients have to have insurance.
Fortunately, he has that Miami support network there. His family takes care of him while his friends track down a new clinic. And finally, he gets seen. Fortunately, they don't see any signs of pneumonia. They prescribe him some antibiotics and rest. A few days later, he starts to feel better, just in time to fly back to San Francisco.
Did he tell you that he was having chest pains?
He didn't tell me any of that.
But with the trip given over to this health scare...
Have you told your family about Sean?
No.
It seemed like a really clear sign about why he shouldn't leave Miami. He's got a whole support network there. Family, friends, clinics. They may have just saved his life. An illness can come out of nowhere, and if he moves to San Francisco, how many people can he really count on in an emergency? In any case, Pedro's eager to put that behind him and relax. We see him and his roommates having fun, going out, exploring the city, throwing parties for each other.
Happy birthday, Pedro.
My birthdays have never been about gifts. They have always been about family. And my roommates really made it nice. I think they made a great attempt to make me feel good and make me feel at home.
Getting close.
There's so much about Pedro that I love. He treats other people very nicely.
Just normal goofing around for someone in their early 20s. But the friends are also a little concerned.
Pedro's had some illnesses, but I don't think he thinks of himself as a sick person, though.
Pedro's working constantly. He's doing as many talks as he can. He knew he was working too hard.
I have to change. I have to do something. And I don't take care of myself as much as I should.
And soon the symptoms come back.
I found out that my temperature was 104.
I was terrified.
Pedro doesn't want to slow down again. He's there with a purpose. They only have a few months to tape the show. Any time spent resting is time he's not delivering his message. And he wants to spend that time helping others. Fortunately, there are also people who want to help him.
The doctor said that I should go to the emergency room.
Don't be nervous, just go. Just go so they can get it down.
During this time, you could see Pam and Judd kind of unofficially team up, working together to take care of their friend. Pam's got a personal history with this.
You know, the first patient I ever had died of AIDS. It's still not the same. It is not the same as Pedro living in our house.
It's just too big. I've never, ever had to deal with this.
Remember, Judd wanted to do the show for fun. At first, he was mad about having a roommate with HIV. And now...
Pedro and I have become very, very close. Pedro's my friend. What are you supposed to do when your friends die?
Fortunately, San Francisco is one of the best places in the world for HIV healthcare. Sean gets Pedro to an emergency room, and the news is mixed. It's pneumonia. But...
it was caught as early as you could possibly catch it.
And while Pedro heals, Pam and Judd do one more thing to help. They knew Pedro didn't want the real world to depict him as helpless.
He had said several times that he didn't want this to become, the expression I gave him, he didn't want it to become the movie of the week. He didn't want the sickly AIDS boy. And I told him, like, yeah, the movie of the week. He wanted to show himself living.
It would be very easy for the show to fall into the same tropes as other TV shows, which would undermine the whole reason for being there, to show that people with HIV can thrive. So, Pam and Judd talked about how they could protect him.
It is the one calculated thing that she and I did in this way was we didn't talk about it on camera that we thought he was having health problems.
When the producers asked them to talk about how Pedro was feeling, they lied. They say, he's fine. And after a few days of treatment, he was doing better.
People bounce back, and maybe I didn't give Pedro enough credit for being quite such a fighter, which he is.
And a few days after that, they can take him out to the park. He runs around, he doesn't lose his breath. They go horseback riding. He's doing great. You can see, maybe Pedro has more family in San Francisco than he thought. Not biological family, but found family. Finding those chosen people who aren't related to you but look after you, that's such an important part of growing up for a lot of queer people. And now, here's a gay man going out into the world, forming a new support network with friends, a boyfriend, relationships that he needs to stay happy and healthy. You don't often see that in mainstream media of the 90s, when queer people are often accessories for straight main characters. So I think it's really exciting to see how much attention this gets on MTV. But it's not all fun. One afternoon, Pedro and Judd run into a protest. There's a homophobic church in town to protest a funeral. And that's eye-opening for Judd.
There are thousands of us and like 20 of them with these grotesque signs, and they started getting pelted with eggs. I felt weird because I felt bad for Pedro. It bugged him a lot.
Pedro tries to find some dark humor in it.
When I die, I want to die like this, I want to protest, I want big crowds of people protesting me and all that stuff,
But this is exactly the kind of thing that stressed him out about being so openly gay, that sometimes even San Francisco might not be as safe for gays as you might want. And you should be at least able to get away from that homophobia when you go home. But Pedro's home life was getting stressful too.
Okay, that was convenient. But wait, let me talk. It's like I have to scream over you.
It's because of the dirtbag roommate, the self-described bike messenger Puck. Whenever Pedro talks, Puck interrupts.
You can't have a conversation with him, or you can't have a conversation with somebody else around him, because he brings everything back to him.
Well, it's right in the eyeball.
He's dismissive.
It bothers me if it's all AIDS, 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 Mr. AIDS man, gay activist.
I would never go out like Pedro anyway.
cool
I
that
wouldn't
he's
go out whining.
sacrificing and he's not whining, he's educating.
Pedro even overhears Puck egging Rachel into making insulting gay jokes.
And I'm not sure if they knew I was in the room listening to the conversation. I mean, I was right there in the room. They probably don't see anything wrong with it. So I just told myself that I was just gonna let it go, and if it happens again, then I'll bring it up.
Puck clearly seems jealous of all the attention that Pedro's been getting, and he's determined to make the show about him.
I'm sicker than Pedro.
One thing about being out with Puck that bothers me, he talks about Pedro a lot.
When Puck sees Judd and Pam spending all their time with Pedro, he tries to turn the other two roommates, Rachel and Corey, against him.
I don't really think you know him very well.
I don't want to get to know him. He's the opposite person from me, and I don't have time to know a
Don't you
guy
think
like
you
that.
can learn from somebody who's not like you?
If I know I don't like him, Rachel, I know in 3 minutes, man. My stance is this.
When Pedro does a talk at Stanford, Puck takes Rachel and Corey on a day trip so they can't attend.
Rachel really wanted to see it, and I did too.
I know enough about AIDS to not go to Pedro's functions because he didn't go to mine. So I don't need to be educated by Pedro.
Pedro's trying to get people to care about HIV. Puck is telling people they shouldn't. Pedro doesn't want conflict, so whenever Puck's around, he just leaves. But that's not great. His roommates are part of his main support network. Their concern may have saved his life. And finally, one night when Puck's not around, Pedro can't hold back about his frustrations.
What it hurts me is that because of him, I am isolating myself from you guys.
And not only do they hear what he's telling them,
When I'm in the confessional, all I'm doing is talking about you. And I don't want to lose that.
they feel the same way. So they call a house meeting and they start to talk. They realize Puck has been rotten to all of them.
Puck dominates the scene so much that other people don't really have a lot of time to connect.
You're a great talker.
You just shut up.
Can you listen?
I've had it with you.
Hey.
Puck interferes directly and indirectly with all my relationships with men.
I feel so helpless and weak when I'm with Puck.
Exactly.
I'm talking to Pam about how I feel.
I'm telling you how to feel. It's on you. If you step on me, I'm gonna rage. And most people can't handle me raging.
With Puck there, they try to negotiate. Remember how patient Pedro was with Rachel? A saint. But this is different.
I have been doing what I'm doing right now for years, man, and I'm not gonna stop because of somebody else's little trip. I'm not really too big on the compromise thing. I'm a steam train, man. There's no stopping me.
Trying to figure out a compromise is just a waste of time. And finally, Pedro realizes that.
I refuse
Don't get in
to
my
put
face and be
up
stupid.
with your
Down and be an
I
adult,
refuse
Pedro.
to put up with your
He tells the other roommates,
I'm saying as long as Puck lives in this house, Pedro does not live in the house. So I'm choosing to get myself out of the environment.
that is the right call, cutting a manipulator and an abuser out of his life. But it also means the roommates have to decide. If they want Pedro to stay, they've got to kick Puck out. Surely, that won't need debate for more than a fraction of a second, right?
It's very difficult for me to say, let's kick Puck out because I can't, it's...
Of course, Rachel is the lone holdout. She was the one who was scared to be around Pedro at first, and she's still defending Puck that night. She's trying to both sides it, like Puck's position is just as valid as Pedro's. So while the roommates debate, Pedro packs up. And that's the kick in the pants that Judd needs.
I wish we could work it out. I don't actually see that now. I think Puck should leave. If you want to call that a vote, then fine.
And one by one, they go around the room.
I would much rather have Pedro stay here than Puck.
Rachel still hesitates. The other roommates say they've been left with no alternative. And then finally,
I agree.
it is a real testament to Pedro's humanity that they do ultimately side with him. He'd been so worried about how he'd be treated, and now he's got allies in the house who'll stand up for him. He's not alone. And with that, Puck is out. Sometimes making one change can solve so many problems.
Everyone on separate occasions has commented about how peaceful the house is now.
My friend Melinda bought me some sage and comfrey. All I can say is, Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah.
Now, it wasn't all conflict for Pedro. During this strife at the house, things are going great with Sean. How great?
He asked me to marry him.
That's pretty great. Of course, everybody's thrilled.
Yes, we are engaged.
Mazel tov.
With the possible exception of the producers, who were probably furious that Sean proposed off camera. But good for him. Not everything needs to be content. In any case, hearing a same-sex couple talking about marriage on TV is huge. A handful of shows had featured same-sex commitment ceremonies, but they tended to involve side characters, or to focus on how uncomfortable the main characters were about the idea.
Look, I can accept the fact that he's gay, but why does he have to slip a ring on this guy's finger so the whole world will know?
Instead, here's a main cast member talking about marrying his boyfriend, and nobody is the least bit uncomfortable. Well, actually, one person's a little wary. Pedro.
I don't know what I want to do.
On one hand, he's in love with Sean. On the other, they've only been dating a couple of months. His friend Alex makes a good point.
If you have an argument or something happens, okay, then what? Whoa. You're on the next plane? Because what else, who else is there?
He's right. Not having the family around could be a risk. Pedro knows it, and the stress of that decision, chosen family or biological family, that puts a strain on their relationship.
Me and Sean have been, arguing a lot.
Okay, Sean.
You don't feel this is the appropriate time to talk about it?
Who says I didn't want to talk about it?
We don't see the worst of it on the show, but Judd later wrote that Pedro was really freaking out about possibly moving cross-country to be with Sean. Pedro felt like it was abandoning his family. He was scared if he ever needed them, they might abandon him. Plus, hanging over everything was a fact nobody wanted to acknowledge.
Everybody was living with HIV/AIDS at the time knew it was, you were maybe sitting on a bomb, that everything could be fine and then everything could not be fine.
Judd did his best to talk Pedro through his anxiety. He told him, leaving home is part of growing up. Nobody's abandoning anyone. And he'll have friends nearby. In Pedro's position, I think a lot of people would have played it safe. But the more he talks it over, the more he realizes.
I have to take risks. I have this shot at really being happy, of really having something that I always wanted. I have a chance to have that, and I don't want to give it up. There's no doubt in my mind that I want to spend the rest of my life with him.
Or, as he told Judd,
there's no screwing around. We need to do this. We need to do this now. I need to live. I need to live my life. I need to do this.
So they start planning a wedding. Something modest, small, just a few close friends and family. And as anyone who's planned a wedding knows,
what started out as just something private and basic between the two of us, and it sort of evolved into a fairly large event.
In the back of everyone's head, they knew the guest list was actually in the millions because of all the TV cameras. They wanted it to be perfect, not just for Pedro and Sean, but to make a good impression on all those viewers who'd be seeing something like this for the first time, a gay couple committing to each other. And behind the scenes, the producers wanted to give it the best possible treatment too. They gave the whole crew a warning.
Okay, we are not a part of this. There will be no crying. There will be no hugging. There'll be no reacting to anything going on. We are observers. And you guys stay out of it.
That wasn't easy for him. Like the roommates, the crew had gotten close to Pedro too.
Billy Rainey, who is later producer on the show, at that point was our chief sound engineer. Billy said, he's there, holding the boom mic and just wiping tears away.
And when the big day comes, it is genuinely a lovely ceremony.
Feel a connection or a closeness to Pedro that I have to anyone else in such a short period of time. I know one thing's for sure, I don't want it to go away.
With great speeches.
And I knew that I was going to be in love with him, that I was going to fall in love with him. It is a lot easier for me to face my own fears and face the uncertainty of my own life, knowing that he's there.
And when Alex, the friend from Miami who was skeptical, gets up to talk...
I may be losing a roommate, but I'm gaining a beautiful apartment in Coral Gables.
Even he's come around. This was still years away from marriage equality getting full federal recognition, but as far as everyone there is concerned, the legal recognition isn't what this is about. It's about how much Sean and Pedro love each other. And even though they know there might be viewers who aren't fully on board...
Well, when I think of marriage, I think of my parents. So obviously, Sean and Pedro don't fit the mold.
They also knew that seeing this could change how people saw gay couples.
Sitting down and discussing our relationships, he talked about Sean, and I think it was for the first time in my life I was seeing how parallel relationships are.
And hopefully feel as happy for Pedro and Sean as everybody else there.
This is not something that I've ever encountered before, but it felt strangely right. This is an ordinary occurrence, or rather it should be.
After that, the season has one more wrap-up episode, and then it's done. Everyone goes out their own separate ways. But the period after the shoot was one of the most nerve-wracking of all. After 5 months of being followed around, going back to normal life was surprisingly difficult. Here's Danny from Real World New Orleans again, talking about the period after filming his season.
We were paid a pittance for this, a few $1,000s. We were sent with a phone bill from MTV. I kid you not, for long distance calls. It did something psychologically to, I think, all of us. Coming down out of the high of that stress of continually being watched, we had 2 or 3 days where we would just have spontaneous fits of vomiting.
Plus, now that the cameras were gone, they'd have no control over how they'd be depicted. This is before people talked about hero and villain edits on reality shows. But everybody knew that some roommates would come off as good, others as bad. And with the big roommate showdown in the middle of the season, the editors would probably cast one side as wrong and one as right. So would they side with Pedro, or would they make it look like everyone unfairly ganged up on Puck? There were some early warning signs. Critics who saw the first few episodes wrote warmly about Puck's animal magnetism. They said he had the show's most alluring personality, a free-spirited Lord of the Flies. And knowing now what works on reality TV, of course, a sociopathic narcissist would come off as the star. So for the time being, the roommates struggled to get back to normal life. Well, not entirely normal. They still had to do promo for the show.
You're looking at the cast of the Real World, and I'm Pedro, and the nicest one of all.
There was plenty for Pedro to be nervous about, especially how viewers would react to him. That stress can take a real toll. I talked about the feeling with Scott Flanary, one of the winners of The Amazing Race in 2017.
I was very conscious about how I came across on TV for the general public. And I thought, okay, when this is being aired, I'm going to be the subject of X number of negativity. I'm going to be talked about online. Am I okay with that? No one can prepare you for the feeling of obscurity into your 15 minutes of fame. There is no rule book. And when you finish filming, CBS or the other networks, they don't give you any sort of guidance.
There's a link to my full interview with Scott in the description as well. So, not knowing what the edit would show, everybody's stress built to the broadcast of the first episode.
We're watching it on a semi-big screen in the house that we just lived in. And Pam cried hysterically.
I don't know if anybody knew why I was crying when I was watching the first episode.
She felt that after the first 2 episodes, like, it's going to be okay. They're going to do right by him. This is him. It's an honest portrayal. He comes across so well. It's going to be okay.
And it was really being so relieved that Pedro was coming across with such richness and that the story was really going to be, like, fair to him.
But would the rest of America see him the same way? Pedro didn't want to wait to find out. He was focused on making the most of the interest that the show would hopefully bring to his work. But capitalizing on that was a challenge, because reality stars weren't as big a deal then as they are today. I talked to Jonathan Holmes, who was on Road Rules in the 90s, about how fleeting that fame was.
At that time, if you got famous for being on reality TV, it was almost like being on the news for 15 minutes. And sure, people were going to see you, but then when the news is over, they're not going to see you.
You can check the links in the description to watch my full interview with Jonathan. So to make sure that he could get his message out, Pedro lined up a ton of talks and appearances as the show prepared to air in June of '94. He flew around the country. He spoke at an international conference on AIDS. He even addressed Congress about HIV education, which is pretty impressive since Congress was not an institution with a lot of respect for MTV.
What is it, Buff Coat and Beaver or Beaver and something else they had? I haven't seen it. I don't watch it.
Finally, the season premiered at the end of June 1994. And
everybody my age watched The Real World, and that meant they were watching Pedro.
We fell in love with him on that show. How could you not?
From the very first episode, people adored Pedro. Queer audiences.
In my small gay community on campus, we all felt like, wow, he was our hero.
And straight audiences, many seeing someone like Pedro on TV for the first time. Here's Jonathan Holmes from Road Rules.
I looked up to Pedro because he not only pushed the boundaries of what someone would do on TV. An openly gay man with HIV was completely unheard of.
Now, admittedly, Jonathan came from a very tolerant family.
My family often encouraged me to be more gay, and my mom was like, I know you're gay, so just be more gay. I'm like, Mom, I'd be gay if I felt like it, but I don't feel like it right now. She's like, just think about it.
But even he had something to gain from watching Pedro.
I learned about him, and I learned about how I should be with people in general, and I learned to be less homophobic, certainly.
It is hard to overstate just how new this was. Pedro would get letters from viewers saying things like, I never thought anyone could change my opinion on homosexuals and AIDS. Because of you, I've seen the human side of something that once seemed so unreal to me.
For a very small period of time in the summer of 1994, us, the cast of The Real World, were as famous as the cast of Friends. The entire planet Earth was paying attention to him there, and that was so cool. You know, walking when he couldn't walk around the streets anymore without people recognizing him, especially in San Francisco. They went to a roller night in San Francisco, and they got mobbed. They couldn't, and Pedro was finally happily shouting over everyone, let me go get my shoes. I'm gonna get my skates. I'm going to go around once, and then I'll talk to everybody.
Riding that high, Pedro was looking forward to moving to San Francisco to be with Sean, and still working as hard as he could.
He went back to Miami, then he was in LA, and now he's flying back to New York to do CBS This Morning, and I told him, you're nuts, slow down.
He was determined to make the most of this spotlight. But as they got into the summer of '94, people noticed something was wrong.
He would forget a few things, forget where a restaurant was, not totally forget, but didn't know exactly. He was a little disoriented.
Pedro was scheduled to be on a talk show in New York. He flew up, but then canceled at the last minute. MTV staff were worried. They told him to come to the office. And when he did,
he hit bottom. There was something wrong. He was disoriented.
Fortunately, New York was home to one of the best hospitals in the world for people with HIV. MTV staff knew about it. They brought him in. They got him admitted that day.
And he didn't leave New York for 3 weeks.
Judd and Pam flew out to be by his side, and the family arrived too. Together, the family and the friends kept Pedro company. They helped him through appointments and tests. He'd been so worried about having to choose between his biological family or his chosen family, and it turned out, in a time of need, he could count on both. And finally, they got a diagnosis. It was a virus, a common one most of us have in our bodies. Usually, the immune system keeps it under control. But Pedro's immune system was failing, and that virus had entered his brain. In 1994, there weren't any effective treatments, and the prognosis was not good. Pedro's family and friends were now in a very painful position. Just as the show was taking off, they had to become spokespeople for him.
Pedro has grown steadily worse since his initial hospitalization. Like many young people, Pedro has no medical insurance, and a trust was formed to aid him in paying for his medical costs.
As sick as he was, there was something else weighing on Pedro. All the events that he had to cancel while he was in the hospital. A year earlier, Pedro had attended a reception at the White House and posed a question.
And I wonder now, as I look around me, who's going to pick up my torch?
There weren't many people at the time who could talk to audiences like he could, and there was still so much more for him to do. Fortunately, there was somebody who might be able to help.
And Pedro told me, what I want you to do is to go out and tell people my story.
Instead of canceling appearances, Judd went out in Pedro's place.
This is my friend Pedro, and this is who would teach me everything I know about AIDS, and he teach me a lot about friendship, and he would teach me a lot about just being a human being.
Remember, when they first met, Judd was afraid to even live with someone who was HIV positive. Now he's going out and talking about it to whole crowds.
I had a really good teacher. I mean, a really exceptional teacher.
This wasn't picking up Pedro's torch. Judd was doing something different, reaching people like him who were misinformed, or who were scared, or who thought it was something that only gay people needed to worry about. Judd could show them how easy it is to learn, and how easy it is to be a friend to someone with HIV. Pedro's family took up the cause too.
I want to share my brother's life with everyone, and I want to continue talking about my Pedro.
It must have been such a huge comfort for Pedro to see that he didn't have to do this work alone, that the people who loved him wanted to see his mission succeed. Once again, his biological family and his chosen family working together. As the summer wore on, people saw Pedro dating, doing talks, having a good time with his friends on TV. But if they picked up a newspaper, they'd see a very different story. MTV cast member hospitalized again. 22-year-old losing battle with disease. Doctors called his illness unrelenting. Since he was still uninsured, MTV helped pay his hospital bills and travel for his family. They directed viewers to donate. A radio station held a fundraiser for them, and so many people called to donate that they overwhelmed the switchboard. As the summer wore on, the whole country was getting more and more worried about him. And when I say the whole country...
Hello, Pedro. It's President Clinton. I just called to tell you I was thinking about you and praying for you.
Obviously, it is a big deal to get a call from the president to check in on you when you're sick, but this was especially huge. Less than a decade earlier, when Rock Hudson's health was failing, Rock's friends begged the then-president Ronald Reagan for help. There was an American military hospital that could treat Rock, but he needed government approval to get in. Rock had been friends with the Reagans for years, and he thought they could help. But when his friends reached out, the Reagans refused to do anything. They just ignored him. And not just him. For most of the 80s, Reagan did almost nothing to address the epidemic. He wouldn't even talk about it, wouldn't allocate funding for research and education. It was in part because of that inaction that by the early 90s, HIV/AIDS was the leading cause of death for all Americans between the ages of 25 to 44. President Clinton, on the other hand, got more involved. Now, he wasn't perfect, but he instituted a ton of changes, from policy to funding. And he took a personal approach. He was known for reaching out to people like Pedro to learn about their lives.
It's important for the president to speak, but it's also important for the president and the administration to hear. And you don't learn much when you're talking.
And not just that, but when Clinton called, he asked if there was anything that he could do to help. Unfortunately, Pedro's friend Alex was there. He jumped in to say, yes, actually, there is something. It had been 14 years since Pedro's family was separated, and since then, only one of his siblings had gotten out of Cuba. The rest were still there, now with spouses and families of their own, over a dozen people. Alex wanted to know if there was any way the rest of the family could be brought to the U.S. Now, that was a big ask, even for the president. Relations with Cuba were not great. Congress had just passed a bill that tightened the embargo, restricted travel even more. The sponsor of that bill said outright that it was meant to wreak havoc with that island. But Clinton ordered the State Department to get to work. There were weeks of intense diplomacy. And then...
they got the visas for all of the rest of them to come to the United States and to finally be reunited for the first time since Pedro came over on the boat lift.
And they weren't just there for a visit. They were put on a path to citizenship in the U.S., so they wouldn't have to be separated again. One night, Pedro's vital signs started to drop. He had trouble breathing. His family and friends stood around him, holding a vigil, praying all night long. They felt sure this was it. In the middle of the night, Pedro opened his eyes. He saw everyone standing around him, and he said, "What the hell's going on?" Everybody burst out laughing. His vitals were stabilizing. He was going to make it through the night after all. But they knew he was getting worse, and Pedro knew that better than anyone. Pedro talked to them about the time that his mother was battling cancer, a 2-year ordeal that was painful for her and everybody who loved her. He told his family he didn't want to put them through that again. Not for my sake, he said. I won't do that to them. He wanted the family to know when his condition got too rough, he didn't want to prolong things. And as the weeks went on, the country saw Pedro go on dates. They celebrated his work. They saw the roommates standing by him. They saw him get engaged. But in the hospital, he was getting worse. By fall, he wasn't able to get out of bed. And as the infection attacked his brain, his ability to speak slowed down, and then he couldn't talk at all. Then he couldn't eat. As the last few episodes neared, Pedro became unresponsive. And his family made the call to honor his wishes and take him off life support. There's a photo of everybody gathered around him. It's hard to see how sick he was. But Pedro had said he didn't want people to look away.
There's not 1 second of my day that I am not aware that I am HIV positive. But that doesn't mean that my happier moments are less happier. And I don't want to forget that I have AIDS, and I don't want you to forget that I have AIDS.
The final episode aired on November 10th, 1994. By that point, Pedro hadn't spoken in weeks. He was under 100 pounds. Pam and Judd and his family spent the night of the last broadcast in Pedro's room, just listening to him breathe.
And then morning came, and the nurses came in to just change the sheets like they did every morning. And they just pulled his sheet back, and he died.
AIDS has claimed a young man who made an enormous impact on a generation of young Americans. Pedro Zamora died in Miami today at the age of 22.
The whole country had gotten to know Pedro like a friend, and they wanted to mourn him like one. MTV aired a memorial service, and here's how it opened.
Today, I'd like to recognize Pedro Zamora, a young man who's fought tirelessly on behalf of people with AIDS. Over the past few years, Pedro became a member of all of our families. Now, no one in America can say they've never known someone who's living with AIDS.
You couldn't ask for a clearer tribute to Pedro's work. He went on the show in the hopes that he could explain HIV to the country. And now, here's the president acknowledging how important that work was.
The challenge to each of us is to do something about it and to continue Pedro's fight. Pedro, all of us are very proud of you.
Judd later wrote, it was touching to see how much Pedro mattered to so many people. But also, on a personal level, he just missed his friend.
I think sometimes people forget that Pedro was just 22. He was still just a kid. He was still... He was this 22-year-old kid from Miami who left home for the first time and wanted people to know who he was.
So, what was Pedro's impact? Was getting on the show truly worth it? Well, his friends could see one immediate effect.
I met dozens, and I do mean dozens, 20 to 30 to plus young people who told me that after they watched him on the show, they came out to their families. He gave them the courage to do that.
And it wasn't just coming out that Pedro inspired.
I want to thank everybody for coming and to help us inaugurate the Pedro Zamora Youth HIV Clinic, which is a lot more than a clinic. It will be a safe haven and a beacon of hope for so many young people.
In the years that followed, Pedro's family and friends started a foundation in his name, a clinic, named a street after him, did everything they could to make sure people remembered not just his name, but his message. The message is what mattered. Remember that question he asked at the White House reception?
And I wonder now, as I look around me, who's gonna pick up my torch?
Here's Judd explaining what he meant.
As far as what he meant about the people picking up his torch, he meant young people just like him, like finding those young people to carry Pedro's torch. It wasn't about us. It was about finding them.
That would be the real test of his work, whether others would want to follow in his footsteps. So, did that happen? In fact, there were so many people that took up his torch that the National AIDS Foundation established a scholarship to help more of them go out into their communities to do talks just like his.
When I first heard that I received the scholarship, I cried.
To hear from an outside source, hey, we see you, we see the work that you've been doing, that just felt so good. It felt so validating.
It really inspires me to continue doing the work that I'm doing now.
That scholarship's still running today. It's helped hundreds of people continue Pedro's work.
Pedro's entire mission was to educate young people, and it's wonderful to know that will continue in his name. So thank you.
Judd kept working too.
I lecture. I spent the past year lecturing. I'm trying to do that. Pick yourselves up and do something. Whatever it is, there's a clinic in town, every town. There are people with AIDS in every city. Go find them out and just do something.
Part of that, he later said, was because he wanted to fill his time and keep busy so he wouldn't have to face his grief. He didn't know how to say goodbye to his friend or honor his memory. But in doing those talks and meeting people, many of whom had also lost loved ones, Judd saw that one of the ways to honor those they'd lost was by remembering them. So as Judd traveled the country and talked to people, he also started working on a graphic novel about Pedro. It's called Pedro and Me, a deeply moving account of Pedro's life, their friendship, and Pedro's dream of saving others. Pedro and Me was published in 2000, and it won a ton of awards. Publishers Weekly named it one of the best books of the year, the American Library Association recommended it for kids, UCLA put it on a required reading list for incoming students in 2013. And since then, Judd has kept going as a successful writer and illustrator, with his own original material like the High-Low series, and he's written for Batman, Superman, Green Arrow, many more, often including queer characters.
I think we can handle a couple of gay people here and there. I think we can handle a few more people of color here and there.
Pam kept Pedro's work going too. She completed her fellowship in AIDS prevention studies at UCSF. In 2007, the California State Senate appointed her to a committee overseeing research and public education programs. And today, Pam's working as a professor and serving as a director at UCSF School of Medicine. And she's still speaking on issues related to HIV/AIDS and public health. especially for youth. And one other major milestone for both Pam and Judd, something that's just hinted at on the show.
Judd and I have been talking a lot lately.
She's really cool. She's also kind of sensitive, and she's also funny, and we get along.
They didn't talk about it on camera, but as the show was taping, they gradually realized how much their friendship meant to each other. And in a reunion special a few years later,
The question everyone asks me is, what they want to know is, have I finally found somebody? So, well, yeah, I have found somebody. I guess what they always say is that, you don't have to go too far from home to find where your heart is. Is that the cliche?
Pam and Judd got married in 2001.
There are so many reality shows that are designed to make people who are strangers fall in love. That's not actually what the real world was, and then that's what you guys managed to pull off.
They have 2 kids, now about the same age that they are when they went on The Real World, and together, Pam and Judd are still bringing Pedro's message to the world.
What's the most important thing you learned from Pedro?
If I had to pick one, and it still holds true today, is that, that people are living with AIDS, not dying from it. That was Pedro's message.
Of course, they still think a lot about how much they miss him.
And Pedro in my head is he's still a kid. He's always going to be, he was, and I'll get through getting choked up. He was my little brother back then, and he's still with my little brother now, but we'd be old, and that would have been fun.
And about how much has changed. For one thing, there are so many more HIV-positive characters on TV now, even on Sesame Street.
We all know you can't get HIV just by touching someone or by being friends with them.
And they're no longer depicted as exclusively tragic or dangerous. In part, that's because the science around HIV has come so far. Back in the 90s, Bill Clinton didn't just call people with HIV to see how they were doing. His administration created an education campaign focused on teens and young adults. He appointed the first federal AIDS policy coordinator, increased funding, oversaw an acceleration in research, which led to the FDA approving over 36 new drugs within just a few years, including treatment that now prolongs the lives of people with the same infection that Pedro had.
This is a disease, and we have never before had a disease we could not conquer. We can conquer this.
At the start of Clinton's term, getting an HIV diagnosis meant you could have as little as 1.5 years to live. By the end of his term, life expectancy was over a decade. And it kept increasing, especially under President Obama.
Fighting HIV/AIDS in America and around the world will require more than just fighting the virus. It'll require a broader effort to make life more just and equitable for the people who inhabit this earth.
During Obama's term, the FDA approved PrEP, a suite of treatments that can prevent the virus from being transmitted at all. Plus, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, stopped the practice of insurance companies denying coverage for pre-existing conditions, stopped giving people a reason to avoid getting tested. That one change reduced the percentage of people with HIV who are uninsured by about half. When Pedro got his diagnosis,
I will probably not see the age of 30. I will probably die before I turn 30 years of age.
Today, with treatment, the life expectancy for people with HIV is the same as people who are HIV negative.
We've come a long way in the fight against AIDS, and we can't let up now. For those whose lives are still at risk, and for those who didn't live to see this moment, let's keep working for an AIDS-free generation.
In fact, there have been so many advances in recent years that according to the UN, AIDS could be eradicated in every country by the end of the decade. Not just suppressed, not just ended in the US, totally eradicated worldwide. All that's needed is education and access. Now that might sound ambitious, but a lot of countries are already meeting the eradication targets set by the UN, and many others are close. And there are a lot of promising signs that we're turning a corner. For example, there's a youth camp in Minnesota for HIV-positive youth. When they opened in the mid-90s, they served hundreds of kids every year. But this year, they closed their doors because childhood HIV is now so rare, they simply didn't have any more campers. And many of the kids who attended, thinking they only had a few years left, they're now approaching their 30s and 40s. But there's another ACT UP slogan that's appropriate here. AIDS isn't over yet. Hitting that goal of eradication by 2030 depends on all of that work continuing. And that's not a sure thing.
I, like many of us, was disappointed or shattered by the results of the election, and expected the world to be in a slightly better place and a little bit more hopeful than we had been in the past.
During his first term, Trump tried to cut funding for HIV research. to cut $1 billion from global AIDS programs, to stop Medicaid expansion for uninsured people, and to completely eliminate funding for AIDS education and training centers. And his administration is very clear about what they're planning next. Trump allies have published their plans to cut programs that deliver low-cost medication to people who can't otherwise afford it.
These Republican efforts do threaten a significant chunk of HIV funding, that's fair to say.
They say they're going to kick people with HIV out of the military, potentially cutting them off from healthcare. Trump's nominee to run Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy, says he wants to fire people working on HIV research. And he spread false rumors that AIDS isn't caused by HIV, but by the homosexual lifestyle. These are deranged ideas that people fought tooth and nail to stop in the 1980s and 90s, and it is incredible that we're heading back to those dark days. Not only that, but right now there's a case before the US Supreme Court that would allow corporations to prevent their employees from accessing treatment like PrEP. They're very clear about their reason why. They want employer-sponsored health plans to specifically cut off access to PrEP because it primarily saves the lives of queer people. And who's representing those businesses? You're going to be shocked to hear that it's a law firm run by a top official in the Trump administration. The Supreme Court is probably going to decide that case in the next few months. So we will soon find out if your boss can stop you from getting medical care that can save your life. And Republicans are coming after people with AIDS in one more way. They've been trying for years to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, to give insurance companies the gift of being able to deny coverage to anyone who has a pre-existing condition. Not just HIV, any condition. All of the problems that we see Pedro deal with, all of the misinformation, all of the fear, all of that suffering, they want to take us back to those very dark days. So what do we do?
I know what Pedro would do is that he'd be up for the fight. So we got to get our dukes up. And I don't know what that's going to mean or what's going to take on, but we can't be quiet. And we can't disengage. I would say if folks who admire him and are inspired by him, that we should not disappoint him.
30 years ago, Pedro showed us how important it is to care, to make noise, and how one person in the right place can make a huge difference.
You have to find some type of meaning to your life. I have to believe that there's a sense to all of this, that all the pain that I'm going through, that all the anger, all the frustration, that there's something bigger than that.
Now we're at a point when caring, taking action, making noise is as important as it's ever been. When Pedro asked who would take up his torch, people stood up to do just that, and there is still a need for those torches to be carried, to answer his question, to say, it's me, I'm ready.
I think he would be thrilled that his presence on The Real World, him doing the show, did exactly what he wanted it to do. That even 30 years later, young people watch the show and are still struck by his story. And I think he'd be very, very proud.
Huge thanks to everybody who helped me with this video, especially the folks who generously spoke to me: Judd Winick, Danny Roberts, Jonathan Holmes, Scott Flanary. You can find links to Judd's books in the description, including Pedro and Me, and the forthcoming 11th book in his Hilo series. Danny Roberts from The Real World New Orleans now works on queer inclusive educational curricula for schools through the group History Unerased. You can find them at unerased.org. You can check out Jonathan Holmes' writing in Nintendo Force magazine, his video game blog Maximum Utmost, and you can check out his podcast, Talking to Women About Video Games. Find Scott Flanary and news about his improv shows on Instagram at Scott Flanary. And to donate to the Pedro Zamora Scholarship and the AIDS Memorial Grove, visit aidsmemorial.org. In making this video, I found a ton of stories that I didn't have room for in the script. Stories about Pedro, behind-the-scenes looks at the first season of The Real World, where the cast members are now, the messy birth of MTV in the early 80s, and how The Real World inadvertently led to the creation of Daria. I put those stories in bonus videos that I'm posting on Patreon. You can head over there to join me for just $2 a month. You get access to hundreds of bonus videos, plus access to a patrons-only Discord, care packs in the mail, and more. Big thanks to the researchers at the Seattle Public Library, the Library of Congress, and the National Archives, and huge thanks to everyone who makes my work possible on Patreon. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go take a friend sightseeing.
We're walking the streets of San Francisco, looking for a couple of humpback whales.